I wish I was throwing the party instead of telling you about it, but telling you about it we'll have to do today. Good morning, everybody. Finishing up our series called Black and White and Everything in Between, where what we're trying to do is to move away from people who divide the world in sides. There's the black and the white, the good and the bad, and we're trying to move away from that to be people who can live more like Jesus, people as grace and truth. And hold on for a sec. My notes are all out of order. Someone got in my pocket. All right, as I do that, turn to Mark chapter 2. Just get your Bible ready, all right? So you have something to do here. Don't know what happened here. I left page 1 up here. That's why I'm confused. Last service. There it is. I need my notes. I'm glad I found them. So anyway, we're trying to finish up this series, and I want to show you today a story. And rather than teaching you principles or a new idea about the way we live this way, I want to spend a whole lot of time on a story. And we're going to look at it from different angles from 3 of the gospel writers who all write about the same story, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. My goal is to sear this story in our minds and our hearts. And so that when we think about how is it that we're to live in the world, how is it we're to live with people, care for people, interact with people, have conflict with people, this story would be one of the first things we think of following the example of Jesus. I'm going to answer the question, what is it that Jesus is up to? And it's a bit presumptuous, but I want to answer it this way by saying what Jesus does is he's about making connections for people. He's about making connections for every person that has ever lived with God himself. He is the bridge. He's the path. He's the way that people are able to have a permanent relationship with God. He secures that relationship. He breaks down boundaries. He removes boundaries, and he deals with what separates us from him. But in addition, he's also a connector in the sense that he connects people together. And so he'll connect a husband to a wife in a much greater way than they could connect on their own. And he connects parents to their children in a better way than they could just connect on their own. He connects friends better, neighbors, coworkers. He's able to bring about connection at a much greater level than we could create on our own. And he's about connections. And connections really are important. They make the world go round. And if you just think through history and some of the inventions that have caused people to be more connected, you can quickly see that it changed the world. A couple I'll mention from history, just from our country. Back in the 15th century, there was an invention in Europe called the printing press. And it allowed for mass production to be, for certain literature to be printed in mass production. You could make thousands of copies of certain books where they could be shared throughout the world. Well, in the 1700s, a man named Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense. And Common Sense was full of ideas about why the American colonies should have a revolution and why they should oppose the king in England. And Common Sense became one of the main reasons historians look back now on the revolution and say this is why it happened. This is how these 13 independent colonies found unity. So it was a connection of ideas. Back then, the population was much smaller, but a large portion of the American population read Common Sense. So much so, it's the same proportion of Americans that now watch the Super Bowl. So think of that. Think of all of the Americans in our country that watch the Super Bowl, or the commercials, because they count. That number, that percent of people read this little booklet, connecting people to ideas. After the Civil War, there was an expansion and explosion of the railroads throughout the continent. And because of that, people were able to be connected with friends and family and cities and locations that they normally or before could not visit or connect with. It made travel throughout the continent much shorter. Instead of months, it took days. Products were able to be shipped throughout the continent, throughout the country, and so it was a connection not only of people, but of certain products to where people lived. It was a great connection. The phone, the internet, all these things provide connection. Well, what is Jesus up to? Jesus is up to connecting people. He's up to moving through boundaries, removing boundaries, and going around boundaries to bring about connection with God and with people to one another. And so rather than teaching this principle, I want you to get this story. Because the story becomes a starting place on how we view the world. It's a perspective by which we engage other people that's different from seeing the world just in black and whites. That's the system of the world. It's not what we get with the gospel. The gospel takes us further than seeing those on our side, those that are different than us. And this story will help us see that. So Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 13. Jesus meets a man named Levi. Here's what it says. He, speaking of Jesus, went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as he reclined at the table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but to call sinners." And so what we see in the story is a meeting between Jesus and this tax collector named Levi. We're also going to see here that from some of the other passages, looking at Luke chapter 5, that Levi had to leave something. He had a great cost in choosing to follow Jesus. In Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 29, it says, "After he went out, he saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And as he said to him, 'Follow me,' and leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And Levi made him a great feast in his house. And there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with them." And so we see now that there's a party that takes place. And that Levi is actually the host of this party. Levi's had to leave everything behind, Luke says, and now he throws this party for all those that are present. Matthew chapter 9, we get one more important detail about this story. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 and 10 says this: "As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples." Now, an observant person says, "Wow, that sounds like the same story, but two different names." That's right, but it's the same person. Levi is Matthew in the story, the Matthew that wrote the first biography of Jesus that we have in our Bibles, the one that would become one of the original disciples of Jesus, is Levi, the tax collector in this story. It was not uncommon during this time in first century Israel for people to have two names. And it wasn't uncommon for someone like Matthew, who was working with the Romans, to have a Roman Greek name, but also a Jewish name. But it's also plausible that Matthew's name was changed after he began to follow Jesus. If you read the scriptures, you see that when someone kind of had a change in their life and a change of direction of where they were going, their names were changed. Saul to Paul, Abram to Abraham. In this case, it could be Levi to Matthew, but this is the very same person. So Matthew, the Matthew that wrote the first gospel in our Bible, was a tax collector. Now that's significant because tax collectors, to say it in a nice way, were very bad guys. Tax collectors were traitors. They worked with the Jewish monarchy that really wasn't much of a monarchy. They were a bunch of puppet kings. You remember from the Christmas story a man named Herod the Great. Herod the Great got that name not because he was a great leader, but because he was a great builder. But he had sons after his death, and one of his sons is Herod Antipas. And Matthew, as a tax collector, is working for this member of this Jewish monarchy who really shouldn't even be in power. The Jews didn't even recognize them as their king because they were not of the correct bloodline. And Herod Antipas is a puppet king. And he's just in power so that he can get from his own people the taxes that the Romans are demanding. And in return of keeping the peace and collecting taxes from their own people, the Romans told Herod, "Hey, we're going to let you keep your buildings, your power, and your wealth, but you're to do what we tell you to." So he's a traitor. And Matthew is working for him and the whole tax collecting network. Matthew's job is to fleece his own people out of the little money that they had so that the Romans and other Jewish elite could grow rich. They had offices on major roads and towns as to collect taxes when people passed by and entered into certain cities. Tax collectors were well known, and because of that, they were hated. Their whole life was a scandal of injustice and betrayal, using the law of an occupying nation to exploit their own people. They were extortionists, and they were allowed to use terrible means to collect the taxes they were told to collect. They were bad guys. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of examples of this in our country, but if you see the news, you see in Mexico today, we hear all the time how there are corrupt politicians and corrupt people in law enforcement. Not everyone, but many are. Can you imagine what it'd be like to live around corrupt people who are in power and supported by the government? Well, that's Matthew. And because of this, Matthew most likely is a loose and extravagant, reckless young man. He would have had to be this type of person and to have this job, he had to leave his Jewish upbringing. He had to kind of abandon his faith because he's now working with the enemy to exploit his own people. So he had to leave his upbringing, perhaps leave his faith, and even just his traditions and his morality. He had to embrace a whole different way of living. And this is the guy Jesus sees in a tax booth doing the very thing that he's not to be doing, and Jesus gives him the invitation, follow me. In all three gospel accounts, we see the same invitation in two words, follow me, follow me, follow me. We're not told what goes through Matthew's head, but we see his response that he gets up immediately and begins to follow Jesus. Luke says that cost him everything. Probably left this job that was helping him grow very wealthy himself. He was leaving this behind to come and follow Jesus. He was not the first disciple that was given this invitation. Andrew and Peter and others are already with Jesus. They've been called out of their fishing boats. Now Matthew's being called out of his tax booth. So Matthew begins to follow Jesus, but the story continues, and Matthew wants to do something with this, and so he throws a party. In verse 29 of Luke's account, we're told that Matthew has a great feast in his own home. He throws a party. And at this party, there are those that had been following Jesus, the great crowd that was wandering around the Sea of Galilee that's with Jesus, some of his followers. But also at this party, we're told, are Matthew's associates, those that he works with, and those that are his friends. So we're told there were other tax collectors there, and we're given this title that really is as judgmental as it sounds. There were the sinners, which is a ridiculous title. It was a title given by the Pharisees for those that did not obey the Mosaic law. The reason I think it's ridiculous is because everyone is a sinner. But this title was often used for people who lived like Matthew. They're the sinners. And these sinners and tax collectors, the traitors, were at the party with Jesus, his friends, and his followers. Matthew says the party's for everyone. Everyone can come in, and he's the host throwing this great party. Now, at this party, I want you to picture this. Matthew's most recent one-night stand was probably there. His hookups, his friends' hookups, his drinking buddies, other sellouts, just like him. It was a party of the reckless young men and women in that community. They were there. I mean, it was kind of like my wrestling team partying with the wildest fraternity in college. Something bad was about to happen. You just walked in there and said, oh, this is a bad combination. Well, this was a bad combination, at least at surface level. This is the party that Matthew is throwing. And not only is he throwing it, but Jesus is there with those sinners. Why would he do this? I believe Matthew knew what Jesus was up to. Matthew knew that Jesus was about making connections with people. Matthew himself had made this connection with Jesus, and he would learn what that would mean more and more as he would live his life with Jesus. But what he knew now was enough to say, I want my friends to meet Jesus, and I want Jesus to meet my friends. And everyone is welcome because this guy is special. And so he used what he had and threw this party. Now we're told that also at the party, or at least outside the party, because I can imagine the party being so big that the people were piling out of the houses and they're out on the streets. But out on the street are the Pharisees who are keeping a boundary, a line between them and all those sinners inside. And the Pharisees in the story are doing their very best to stir up dissension. And so they pull aside some of Jesus' disciples and they say, do you see what he's doing? Look who he's with. He's eating with sinners and tax collectors. Now, the reason that's important is because Jesus would have agreed with them that to have a meal with a person is a sign of intimacy and trust. To share a meal with someone else was a very, very big deal. And they're saying, this thing of sharing a meal with someone, which is a big deal, your leader, your spiritual leader, he's in there eating with them. And you know what he's doing? He's making himself dirty and he's making you guys dirty. Look what he's doing to all of you. Is this the type of leader you want to follow? See, it was popular at this time in rabbinic teaching to believe that if you ate with someone who was a sinner, that you yourself would become like them. It's just teaching of men. It's not God's truth. But that's what they believed, and so that's why they're referring to the food that Jesus is eating with them. But Jesus would agree, this is really important, and that's why I'm here sharing this meal with them, reclining at the table, having this intimate moment. Now, Jesus knows what the Pharisees are doing outside the house, and he never really let these guys get away with their religious bull, which is a nice way of saying it. And so he goes out and he gives them a dose of their own medicine. And he uses this ridiculous illustration. He said, who is it that a doctor comes to? Does a doctor come to the healthy? Well, he knows the answer, and they know the answer. No, a doctor comes to the sick. And Jesus says, I am to the world, I am to sinners as a doctor is to the sick. And then he mocks them in a sense by saying, I have not come for the righteous. He knows the Pharisees think that they're more righteous than everyone else inside that party. But that's ridiculous in their own thinking, because to be a Pharisee means to study the scriptures, and they knew that there is no one that is righteous before God. So they know the scriptures say that, but they're not living that way. And Jesus says to them, well, I've not come to the righteous like you special people, but I've come for sinners. See, they divide the world in black and whites, and Jesus is using their logic, but he has really come for everyone. He then gives them a dose of the Bible, which is something that you do with legalists. You give them a dose of their own medicine, because they like to give it to you, right? You ever run into a spiritual legalist? He gives them Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. It's the passage Damien read that was up on the screen during worship, where God says, what I desire is steadfast love and a knowledge of God, and not empty rituals or empty sacrifices. Not just going through the motions. I want your heart. But Jesus quotes a different version of Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, where he says, what I desire is mercy and a knowledge of God. So he's saying to the Pharisees who are outside choosing pride and judgment, what I really want, being God, what I really want from people is what Matthew is giving people inside that house. He now has a better knowledge of God than you, and he is giving mercy to the very people you would never give mercy to. And so he gives them a lesson on one of their prophets. What God loves is mercy. And that's what he asks of us, a knowledge of him that leads to mercy towards others. So what is he up to? What we see in this story is that Jesus calls people from all types of backgrounds, different places in their life, different struggles. He calls them all to come and follow him. And so he calls blue-collar workers like Peter and Andrew out of their boat to come and follow him. He calls prestigious, educated men who have been given Roman citizenship. He's powerful and prestigious. Men like Saul, who would become Paul after he follows Jesus, he calls him to come and follow him. He calls a woman, the town harlot and prostitute, who moves from one man to another to find her meaning in life. He calls her to come and follow him. He even calls a religious zealot named Simon to stop his war against the Romans and come and follow him. He calls people from all walks of life. Why? Because Jesus is not interested in an elite club. He's not interested in an elite party of just the religious. He's here to offer a cure, a remedy to the sickness that plagues every person, and that is sin. Every person, the Pharisees and those inside. That's why many people refer to the gospel as good news, because it is the cure to the sickness that affects us all. So what is he up to? He's up to bringing this connection with people. Now, I want to ask you in way of application, how is it that you respond to these actions of Jesus? This is what he's still doing today. He's still connecting people. He's still throwing parties like this for people. If he were here today in his human flesh, he would be at these parties with these people. So how do we respond? Well, in our passage, we can see three different responses. You can either help him, you can watch, or you can hinder the very work that Jesus is doing. So the first one is to help, and that is what Matthew is doing. He's a great example. He's connected everything he has in life to Jesus. He's all in. Luke says he's given up everything to follow Jesus. And so he uses what he has. And so what is it that he does here? He opens up his home. And he's hospitable. And he shares his relationships and his friendships and his influence that he has to throw this party so that people can come and be with Jesus. I'm sure Matthew was also hospitable with his life, his work, even himself. He was an open person saying, come and be with me. Come and be with Jesus. He doesn't move on from his friendships. This is now just a Christian party or a Jesus group party. This is a party for everyone. And look what Matthew does to help. He creates an environment where it's okay to not be okay. There was no place for the sinners and the tax collectors to go and think about God that was safe for them. There were Pharisees everywhere, whether they had that title or not. And it was not safe for them to go and discover their faith, to think about God, so they just didn't go. And if they went one time, they probably ran into someone that hurt them. And so what is it that Matthew's doing? He's creating a place where it's okay to be okay. Now, one reason I wanted to share this passage today is this story, this party, is what our church should be. Do you know that? Our church should be like this party where it's okay to not be okay. This should be the place where if there's nowhere else for people to go and think about God, there's no other relationships in their life, they will come here and they will find people that care and who will allow them to experience Jesus without hurting them. That's what this church should be. I find this very convicting. I think this is what our homes should be, our families, our life groups, our small groups, your community of friends. They're to be open places where it's okay for others to come and not be okay. Where people can come in with their reputations and their judgments, with their good and bad lifestyles, where they can come and join the party and sit back and listen to Jesus and observe him. The wildest people in town, the sex addicts, drug addicts, habitual partiers, the jerks at work, the angry drunk, the thief. How about those that there's just a great wall of separation between us and them right now? The wall between Christians and homosexuals has never been bigger. This church should be the place where they can come. And when they come, they're not going to run into someone that's going to hurt them. We have several people here that have friendships with homosexuals, and we're afraid at times to bring them here because we're afraid of who they'll run into. Sometimes you just get one chance. Or how about people like my dad? My dad thought church was just for a bunch of weak, dependent men. And because my dad was competent, successful businessman, he thought there was no place for a guy like him at church. He just thought it was passive, that you really didn't do any good, that there was no place for someone like him. Well, this is a place for someone like him. It's a place for everyone. It's a place for someone going through a divorce. It's a place for single moms and dads. It's a place for a lonely 20-year-old. It's a place for everyone. Our church should be more like the party than the meeting out in the street. But unfortunately, it's often like the meeting in the street. Matthew understands that Jesus does not see the world just through black and whites, that he's connecting, and so he joins them in this. And so we have a lot to apply just from his example of being someone that helps. Now, there are also those there at the party who just watched. So this includes the disciples, who they're getting to know Jesus, and they're following him, but they have no idea what this is all about yet. And so some of these disciples, early disciples that are there with Jesus, they're probably sitting back thinking, we think Jesus is special, and he's kind of pushing the limits, but this is a big deal. Look who he's hanging out with. And they probably just said, we really shouldn't say anything because we don't have it all figured out yet, so we're just going to sit back. And actually, this is kind of a special moment. These people are connecting with him, and he's connecting with them, and we can't really do anything to help, so we're just going to sit here, and we're going to keep our mouth shut, and we're going to let Jesus do his thing. And so the disciples just watched, and they'd observe what Jesus was doing. And they would grow, and they would learn, and this is the way they would live their life. Read the book of Acts, you'll see it. There were other guests there who just watched. They were Matthew's friends, who maybe for the first time felt like it's okay to not be okay, yet they're around a deeply spiritual person, not just a deeply spiritual person, but they begin to understand that he is, as John described, fully true, full of truth, and full of grace. That Jesus is the most excellent person they have ever met in their whole life. He lives the best way. His path to life is the best way. It's the truest way. And they're sitting there, and they're not repelled from him, but they're drawn to him. And what happens when a person experiences Jesus for who he truly is, grace and truth, not a caricature, not just part of him, but for who he really is, a couple things happen. Number one, people begin to think about following him, but they think of it this way: is it worth it? Matthew's friends begin to weigh the cost of following Jesus. They just saw their friend leave everything to follow him. They know that, in a sense, this is a going away party because he's moving with Jesus. And they're sitting there thinking about the cost of following him. But you know what else they're thinking about? They're thinking about their own lives. And they're reflecting on their life because in front of them is the person who is the truest, most gracious, most wonderful person they've ever met. And they wonder, could I be like him? Could I follow him? I'm sure Jesus gave them a similar invitation to come and follow. They experienced the grace and truth of Jesus in that moment. But while this is happening, remember who's outside. It's the Pharisees. And they're the ones that hinder this process. And I'm sure that Jesus' friends looked out the window or out the door and they saw these Pharisees, and the young men and women began to think, can't these people just leave me alone? Don't they have anything better to do than to tell me all the things I'm doing wrong in my life? What are they going to tell my mother? They're worried about everything. These guys constantly track them down. They constantly judge them. And they know that they're just looking in there with eyes of judgment and shame. These men are the very opposite of Matthew. They can't keep their judgments to themselves. And those inside the party are afraid to go experience them. Yet they're drawn to the one that is full of truth and full of grace inside the party. Now, Jesus, being a good leader, but not just a good leader, like a father, he goes out and he protects his kids. And so he goes out and he deals with the Pharisees. And he stands up for his children. He says it's not okay to speak to them that way. It's not okay to treat them that way. I love them. It's kind of like what I hope for and what I pray for with my 3 sons. I have 3 little boys, and they're wonderful, and they're smart, and they're good boys, but they don't know everything, and they don't always make the right choices. Sometimes they're really naughty, especially the youngest one. And I know that they're going to run into swim teachers and coaches and teachers at school, teachers at church, and other adults who will need to discipline them and instruct them and help my sons learn to grow or learn to change so that they can grow. And I want them to get that. I want my boys to have a chance to change and to grow. But I don't want that truth to be shared to them in a way that shames them and demeans them and hurts them and wounds them. In fact, I would rather the person not say anything at all if that's the way they're going to communicate it. I don't want the person to share the truth that my little boys need to hear with there not being any grace. I want my boys to know from the people that are instructing them and helping them in life that they're for them, that they care about them, that they're their advocates, that they want what's best for them. That's grace and truth. And Jesus said, now you guys stop talking to him. You're just full of truth, but your truth is backwards. You have no grace. You have no room to talk. Leave him alone. And what he demonstrated to everyone in the room is that the world is not divided in black and whites. And what Jesus demonstrated to everyone in the room is that the way you share truth is just as important as the truth that you share. Because of this, it was a special day for everyone there. I'm sure Matthew will never forget what happened. His life changed. The direction in his life changed. He was never the same. This Matthew, who had probably left his faith, the faith of a young boy, rekindles this love of the one God of Israel that he's now found in Jesus, and he's now on a different path following Jesus, and he will never forget what happened. He'll never forget that day. Now, this kind of thing happens all the time. This is what Jesus is doing. He's throwing parties like this for people. Or people like Matthew who have left their faith saying it's meaningless, it's pointless, there's better things in life. He says, come and follow me, and they find that God really is important. And every day, Jesus finds people like Paul, who besides being someone that just trusted in his own moral behavior more than God, this is the thing that's interesting about Paul. He thought Jesus was a liar at first, and he thought this whole thing of following Jesus was a scam. That's why he fought against it. He thought it's bad because it's not true. But once he found out that it's true by meeting Jesus on a road, Paul's life changes. So Jesus calls those that think that this is a lie, and those people can become convinced. He calls people like Peter and Andrew who are just going about their life, working hard, doing the best they can. He ambushes them and says, I want to call you to something bigger. He finds this woman at the well I mentioned earlier and says, you look for affirmation and love in all these other men. Come and find it in me. Come and follow me. These stories help people live the way Jesus did. They help us to live as people full of mercy. And so I want to ask you just to think in the history of your life, where were you when you first chose to follow, if you are a follower? And I don't mean the physical location, so I don't mean the tax booth or the fishing boat. I mean, where were you in life? Were you alone? Were you in a dying marriage? Were you chasing money and wealth? Where were you in life when he asked you to come and follow? Because if you're a follower, it means that you left certain things behind and you changed the direction. Where were you? Remember that moment. Remember how it was okay to not be okay. Remember the grace and truth in his voice and the gentle whisper in your heart that said, come and follow me. I want you to remember that because that causes us to be humble people full of mercy, rather than people that divide the world in black and whites. So where were you in life? I encourage you to write it down. You can share it with us on Facebook. I'd love to read some of those at the end of the service. Address is up there. But I also want to ask you, who is it that you ran into during that time, that special time in your life? Did you run into some Matthews? Or did you run into some Pharisees? And then ask yourself, who are you more like? Because it's easy and it's natural for us to move back into the life that we left and to divide the world in right and wrongs. And the boundaries are just different. They're now called sinners and righteous. We all have a story. And connecting back to your story helps us live as people full of grace and truth. I want to share with you a story of a special day for someone here at our church. This is a story that this person keeps in their heart that allows them to live as people full of as a person full of mercy. This connects them to the story we just read. It says, in 1970, at age 20, I was functioning completely on my own and pretty self-centered. However, there was a little stirring in my heart and some curiosity about Christianity because of some of the changes I was seeing in my sister-in-law who had recently become a Christian. One night, leaving my wife alone in the hospital after surgery and my new baby with my parents, I went out with friends for a night of road racing and drug using. Late that night, I found myself drifting away, and I thought that I was dying. And the Lord spoke to me and told me that everything that I had learned in church as a child was true. But it was too late. I asked for a second chance for my wife, for my child, and he gave it to me. He was in my heart and my mind at that point, and I was a different person. I could not hear the name Jesus without something stirring in my heart. But now listen how, for this person, following was a process. He goes on to say, but something in me still resisted. I didn't want to be one of those Jesus freaks. And it took 2 more years from that point for my mind and my heart to make peace. And I let go, and I started to follow. That was a good day. That was a good day. That's this party all over again. Remembering the party changes the way we see the future. Remembering your party changes the way you deal with the future. And that's what I want for you this morning. If you're in here and you're not yet a follower of Jesus, you're here to hear that, this invitation to come and follow him. To be a follower requires just one thing, that you actually follow. That you follow him to the places that he will lead you. You will follow him in the changes that he wants to make in your life. But you begin to trust him and you begin to follow him and you start this journey. And you can do that today. You can begin to follow. We're going to sing a song right now that's really the invitation that Jesus continually gives people. He doesn't just say, come and follow me once. Those of us that have walked with him a long time, we're always asked the same thing. Keep following me. Are you following? And unfortunately, a lot of times the answer for me is no. I'm following someone else or something else. And so we all have the same question to answer, and that is, are we following? And one of the ways we follow is to be people like Matthew and not someone like the Pharisees. We're going to take communion now. I'm going to make one transition or connection between communion and the message. Remember how I shared with you in rabbinic teaching, they said that if you eat a meal with someone, because it was so intimate, it made you like them, made you one. So if you were clean and they were dirty, you became dirty. Well, in a sense, that's true that you do become one. And Jesus knew that. That's why he shared meals with people. And this whole thing started in a Passover Seder, a meal. And then it continued on. As often as the early disciples had meals together, they would take the bread of the meal and say, this represents his body broken for us. And then they take the cup, which is the wine or the juice, and say, this represents his blood poured out for us. Communion is a time of intimacy, not just between us and God, but with one another. Where, yeah, we are one in the sense that we all belong to him. We are one, that we are a part of one family. And this table is big enough for everyone. There's a seat for everyone at the table, connecting with him and connecting with others. And so although we just have small crackers and a tiny cup, I want you to think of this as a meal that we're sharing together. Because that's what it was meant to be. No more boundaries. They're gone. The world is not black and white. There's one leader who we're all choosing to follow, and the question is, are you following him? Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this story. I pray that you would imprint it on our hearts and our mind. I pray for all of us, including myself, when I begin to drift into judgment and pride. And that's easy to do, Lord, as we earnestly want to walk with you and do things the right way. It's easy to begin to think of ourselves at a higher level than other people and to make dividing lines of those that are saved, those that are like me, those that worship like me, those that look like me, those that spin like me. Lord, I pray that we would resist that. I pray that you would remind us of this story where you went into the house of the wildest guy in town to be with his friends. Lord, I pray that we'd have the humility to see that we're all the sick people that you've come to care for, to heal. And so, Lord, we give ourselves to you. Help us to be more like Matthew than anyone else in that story. Help us to be people who give mercy as eagerly as we receive it from you. And Lord, make us people of grace and truth. In Jesus' name.